Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. So I have a very special guest on today, Tarik LaCour. Welcome to my program.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to read a brief intro. Tarik D. LaCour is a neurophilosopher and cognitive scientist in training and a current Ph.D. student in philosophy and an MS student in psychology at Texas A&M. His primary research interests are in the philosophy of psychology, cognitive science, and bioethics. In addition to his academic work, he is also a sports fanatic with allegiance to the Texas Longhorns, Dallas Cowboys, Los Angeles Lakers, and New York Yankees. Boo to all of them. Devout and believing Latter-day Saint, he lives in College Station, Texas with his wife and daughter, and currently serves as a stake high counselor. And also you have the blog, Footnotes to Hume. So I've been coming across your work. We have a mutual friend in Hannah Sariak, and I thought you bring up a lot of interesting things because well, before we talk about your philosophical underpinnings, maybe just give us a little background about where you were born and maybe a little bit of your religious background in history.
Okay, I was born in Washington, D.C. I remember nothing about that. I was a bit of a military brat. Both of my parents were in the Army. So I was born there. I don't remember it, although I remember one Christmas being in the snow, and that was when we were in Maryland. So I kind of remember that point. But most of my years that I remember, I was in Riverside, California. And then I moved to Utah after my mission, and then came to Texas for graduate studies. I was raised an evangelical Christian, and I was pretty skeptical of it from the time I was probably 7 or 8 until probably about 14 or so. And I went through Mormonism. I came across Mormonism, I should say, rather, when I was reading my set of encyclopedias. I've always been a bookworm, so I read all the encyclopedias from A to Z. And so I came across M, Mormonism obviously is in there, and I was very intrigued by it, and then started asking questions about it from friends that I had, then researched it for about 3 or 4 years, and then joined the church when I was 18, and I've been all in ever since. So although my faith has obviously changed, because your faith should change, I think, as you learn new things and think about them. It has remained intact since I joined the church. So here we are.
So when we had a conversation before, you had said one of your objections to the conventional understanding of God is that you did not believe in a non-corporeal God as a young person. So maybe talk a little bit about that and how that led you into Mormonism.
Yeah, I remember as a child being taught about the Trinity, and while I was somewhat fascinated by it, I just remember not believing it. At first, I thought maybe I'm just too young. As I get older, it'll come, and it never did. Even though I kept thinking about it and kept trying to understand it, and I understand it a lot more now, obviously, than I did when I was a child. But I just never believed in immaterial things. So I just guess I have a materialist spirit, that no pun intended. So then of course, when I started reading philosophy, I started kind of realizing that's more of the majority opinion anyway. But having said that, I always believed in Jesus and in the resurrection. So I was always kind of an odd Christian, I would say. I was not orthodox, because the orthodox opinion is that God is a timeless, immaterial being beyond space and time. And I never believed that, but I did believe in the resurrection and in Jesus's teaching. So stayed the path there. And then once I found the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I was like, oh, okay, I can fit this. Although I had to investigate a while to see if I believed that too. So it wasn't just a quick turnaround. It's years and years of investigation.
So just so you said you believed in Jesus and you believed in the resurrection. As an evangelical being raised in that tradition, did you actually have like a born again experience where you like asked Jesus into your heart as a child or anything like that?
They had us do that in church, although I never felt anything. I've never had any spiritual experiences. That doesn't play a role in what I believe.
Fascinating. So you say that you believe in, since you brought it up, let's just go there. You say you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In a materialistic worldview, what does that mean?
You know, that's that's not as easy as it might seem on its the surface to be, but ultimately that Jesus died and was brought back to life by God is what that would mean. Although I guess that's something Latter-day Saint theology, of course, is it's always how we reconcile the idea of the soul that's material reuniting with the body. But that's more because I guess the soul and the body are more on a continuum. And this is a big problem, I guess, in philosophy of language that we use because Latter-day Saints consider themselves part of the Christian tradition and use similar language. We sometimes think certain things fit very easily and they actually don't once you start delving into them a little bit more. But ultimately it means that for me anyway, and I assume for most Latter-day Saints, that Jesus was raised from the dead and can't die again. So there you go. So how that exactly happened, I have no idea. But there are lots of things I believe in that, and I have no idea how they work.
Okay, well, that's cool. So one of the concepts of, well, first of all, do you believe that there will be a future resurrection of all of creation or all of humanity? Where does the resurrection fit in your worldview?
Do I believe everyone will be resurrected? Is that what you asked?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And will this be at the accumulation of the end of time, or is this like a future? I mean, how do you envision what a mass resurrection looks like?
You know, I guess I don't envision it because, but I assume that means that we will be somewhat similar to what we are now, but on a scale that isn't susceptible to death. But again, how that exactly works, I'm not entirely sure. So
you believe in the preexistence, that we all existed with God in the preexistence?
Yes.
But it was in a physical form?
Yes.
Okay.
It's physical all the way down for me.
That's what I'm thinking. So if God is not outside of space and time in the universe, does he exist within our universe?
Well, I guess I'd have to layer this explanation. I don't know. I wouldn't subscribe to the fact that there's one universe. I would, on the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics, I would think there's a multiverse. So God is within space and time. Whether he's within the same space and time that we are, I'm agnostic about. I don't know.
Well, the reason I ask that is would God be accessible within our physical universe? In other words, could we build a spaceship or some ability to go to him?
Logically speaking, yes, I would say yes.
Okay.
So I guess what your question is, because God's a spatio-temporal being, could he be located by us potentially? I would say yes. Do I expect that to happen? No. But yes, it's possible.
So you believe that because you believe in the multiverse, essentially you believe that material and God are eternal. They've existed forever, right? Okay. And you.
I mean, if you compare this with, I guess this is really the difference between naturalism and non-naturalism. Is there'll be something that exists forever. So is it material, meaning the things that physics studies, or matter, energy, etc., or in space as well, or is it God, some type of non-physical thing? So I would be on the former.
So did God and us in the preexistence, did we evolve into who we are in the preexistence and then continue to grow or evolve? I mean, was there a point where we wouldn't have been aware of ourselves and then we were, or were we always aware of ourselves? Was God always aware of himself?
Right. You're getting at a debate within Mormon theology of our spirits eternal, in the sense of you've always been who you are forever. There was never a time that you didn't begin to exist. You're a necessary being. That would be the view of people, I think, like B.H. Roberts, Blake Ostler, today espouses that view. Or do spirits come to be through kind of some type of cosmic evolution, for lack of a better term? I would be more on the latter side. I don't think there are any necessary beings, so I would say that spirits evolved and came into existence. So there was a time you didn't exist as a spirit, and then a time that you did, and now you exist as an embodied spirit.
So you say you're not a spiritual person. You never experienced like the spiritual feelings or anything like that. Where does the objectivity and subjectivity fit in? For instance, is everything objective? Where does subjectivity fit in?
Well, objective, I would take to mean something that's independent of our opinion. But our access to things comes through subjectivity. So there's room for both. As far as for spiritual experiences, that just hasn't been part of my experience. I couldn't be a religious person if it required religious experience. I assume that there are a lot of people who haven't had religious experience, but they mostly don't talk about that. But yeah, like I said in an interview that I recently did with Public Square magazine, I don't have a spiritual bone in my body. So so often when I'll go to sacrament meetings and people talk about spiritual experiences, I fully believe that they've had those experiences, or at least I hope they're not lying about them, but that's not been my experience. I haven't had those. I don't know why that is, but that's how the cookie has crumbled so far.
So I was an atheist for quite a while. I tell my friends and stuff that I read myself out of Christianity. And so I would say that in many ways, I think in a materialistic worldview and am somewhat skeptical of spiritual, but then as things have been happening to me over the last couple of years, and I've kind of moved more towards a spiritual direction, I've always been spiritually minded. So here I am as a young child having spiritual experiences, talking with God and speaking in tongues and dealing with prophecy and all these kind of things, and then becoming an atheist, right? And then once I start re-engaging my faith, it's almost like immediately the spiritual re-entered into the picture. So that's just kind of my journey. And so I'm just fascinated by you because we're kind of like opposites. I would say like I'm spiritual but not religious, and you would say you're religious but not spiritual.
I've said that to sacrament meeting talk once, that I'm religious but not spiritual. So it's out of my mouth.
Yep. So I find this just having these kind of conversations are important because, like I tell people, this channel has kind of been a spiritual journey for me, and it's grown me spiritually. But then when I talk to somebody like you, I'm like, whoa, I got to talk to this person because I think you have different ideas to think about. I guess the question I have for you is, if God is not outside of space and time, and God isn't the creator, but just merely the chief organizer, why would I want to worship that being?
That's a great question. I think one of the necessary conditions for a being to be called God is they have to be worthy of worship. I talked about this in my fair talk that I gave at the conference last year. I would say that God is worthy of worship because he has the ability to save us, in the sense of resurrect and exalt us. That's why he would be worthy of worship, because he's all loving and all compassionate and willing to resurrect and exalt you to bring you to what he is, rather than just begging for adoration, if that makes any sense. I remember it was David Hume said, no, it wasn't Hume, it was Nietzsche. He said, I couldn't worship a God who wants to be praised all the time. So I agree with him. So the Mormon conception of God, if I can be allowed to use that word, trying to get it out of my vocabulary as President has asked us to do, but that conception of God, I think, almost compels me to worship him, rather than but of my own volition, rather than demanding it, kind of a thing. So that's why I think God's worthy of worship.
And what about Jesus and what he did at the cross and his sacrifice that he made? What does that represent to you?
What do you mean? Are you asking, like, what theory of the atonement do I endorse?
I'm saying within the context of your materialistic worldview, what does Jesus dying at the cross, the atonement, how does that fit into your worldview?
I take the atonement to be that we owed a debt to God, and that we couldn't repay it, and Jesus was able to do that. It's basically a penal substitution theory of the atonement. So, and I'm misusing the word debt there, but you get the broader picture. Some people view that a bit as barbaric, because why should someone have to be tortured to satisfy justice? Or it's also unjust to have someone else suffer for someone else. I don't think either of those things are true, so that doesn't bother me. But ultimately, that's what I think the atonement does. So on that side, I guess I'm still somewhat of a Protestant, because that's the view of the Reformers, is the penal substitution view.
Yeah. So speaking of which, I was going to lead to, while you were investigating the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you also looked at other faith traditions. Maybe tell me about some other Christian and maybe non-Christian traditions that you were investigating as well.
Yeah, I always thought for some reason there should be one church. I don't know why I always believed that, but I did. So my first instinct was Roman Catholicism, but I couldn't affirm the doctrines, even though I love Roman Catholicism for a variety of reasons, from the architecture to the theology, in the sense of how well developed it is. I have a lot of respect for thinkers like St. Augustine, but I couldn't affirm that. Eastern Orthodoxy, more or less the same reasons. As far as non-Christian, I did, in a sense, the materialism was going to rock the boat with any of the Abrahamic faiths, because in Islam, it's a similar conception of God, obviously not identical to Christianity, because there's a Trinity, versus in Islam, it's a Unitarian religion. In Judaism would be much the same thing. I don't recall having investigated too many non-Abrahamic faiths, although I did study them. So that was my view.
So why didn't you become a Unitarian in the Christian tradition?
Oh, that's a great question. Why didn't I become a Unitarian in the Christian tradition? I don't know. I think because for some reason polytheism seemed more plausible to me than monotheism.
Interesting how you brought up you were interested in Catholicism. There's doctrines you couldn't go with. What about the idea of transubstantiation, the literal material that you're actually literally eating and drinking the blood and body of Christ? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, obviously, I don't believe that, as not being a Roman Catholic, although I was very fascinated by it, and I view it as a beautiful thing and a way of Jesus offering himself and his grace to us in the current environment. Stephen Webb, who's no longer with us, wrote a book when he wrote his book about Mormon Christianity, is the name of it, and also his book on Christ and embodiment. He brings up transubstantiation and Mormonism kind of as having similar views.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was, which is something I had thought for a while too, but I'm nowhere near as brilliant as Stephen was.
Yeah, so I wanted to
but to be clear, I tend to feel, and I have felt in the past, more comfortable in Catholic worship services because it seems more worship oriented, and often in Latter-day Saint meetings it feels more like a business meeting. I don't know why that is, but again, I'm not a Latter-day Saint because I'm always just the most comfortable with being a Latter-day Saint. I'm a Latter-day Saint because I believe it's true, and that's the only reason.
Interesting. So, one of the reasons I had Tarik come on is I've been compiling a list of up-and-coming current influencers or future influencers, future scholars, future people who will be playing a role in the 21st century Mormonism, including Tony Fieldson, Nathan Smith, Hannah Sariak, Jackson Washburn, Casey Kern, Colby Townsend, have all been playing an important role in advancing the conversation for Mormonism in a more postmodern context, and will be important players. And you, of course, Tarik, are one of those as well. One of the things that I find so fascinating about you is that you had made the comment that if the priesthood ban still existed in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you would actually still join the church. Let's explore that.
Yes, I said that on Reddit recently when they had me on for Ask Me Anything.
Which I was there too.
I think I responded to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I just said, I'm a Latter-day Saint because I believe in the doctrines of the church and no other reason. And those doctrines would still be true with or without the priesthood ban. I think the priesthood ban was wrong and shouldn't have happened, but that's not a sufficient reason to not join the church or leave it. Obviously, people disagree with me, as lots of African Americans have either not joined the church because of the ban or have left the church because of it, or feel uncomfortable with current racial tensions in the church and in society at large. So I'm a bit of a unicorn on that, I guess. Although not totally. I guess there were people like Darius Gray and others who joined the church when there was a priesthood ban, so it's not like it didn't happen. But obviously, it's a lot easier to join the church as an African American now than it was 50 years ago.
So when you converted, what was the reaction that your family had, and did they bring that up to you?
My family was not that enthused, to put it lightly. And although in recent years they've been more open to the church and not as dismissive, but they certainly were uncomfortable with me joining a church that had a racist history.
I'm curious to get your thoughts on Black Pete, unfortunately named, but that's the only name that we have for him. He was involved in the Kirtland Church early on before Joseph Smith arrived, and he was involved in maybe bringing some charismatic gifts into the church. And he also, according to Mark Staker, he believes that he actually received the priesthood in 1831. Are you aware of that story?
Only slightly, due to my friend Paul Reeves' book, Religion of a Different Color. I am aware that I think he was the first Black man to receive the priesthood in 1830, if I remember correctly. I'm more familiar with people like Walker Lewis, Elijah Abel, and people like those people.
So I guess in your within the context of your belief system, the church you belong to, you believe that there should be just one true church or one church, but it's capable of making mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And you're fine with that?
Yes.
Cool.
If you're uncomfortable with the church making mistakes, you're not going to be able to join any church. That's not a Latter-day Saint problem. That's a people problem. Mm. We're going to make mistakes. Hopefully we can tend away from the large mistakes and make them minimal, though unfortunately we can't do that entirely, but it is what it is. So that doesn't bother me. It's what I would expect.
What kind of, have you gotten a lot of pushback for making that statement that you would join even if the ban was still in place?
Yes.
And just maybe talk to that a little bit.
Oh, from the African American side, been called an Uncle Tom a few times, which is kind of ironic considering that Uncle Tom is a symbol of what a Christian is supposed to be in the story. If you actually read the Uncle Tom's Cabin, he's a symbol of not striking back and turning the other cheek. You know, the kind of the model Christian. So I don't know why people have used that as a slur, but they can. I'll let them do them. From the non-African American side, it's been a bit more mixed. Some people agree with the African American side that that's being kind of an Uncle Tom. Some find some admiration in it, that he's like, oh, you can join the church and be an African American. I ultimately don't think it's really that big of a deal. I just don't. It doesn't bother me that much.
Wow. So you would, based on some of your writings, you would actually consider yourself politically on the conservative side. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how did you arrive to embracing conservatism? Obviously, you're reading David Hume and other things like that, but tell me about your political journey.
Oh, let's see. I think I first started getting into politics when I was in kindergarten and read a book about Abraham Lincoln. And I've always loved him. Then, actually, fun story. So about 2 Christmases ago, my mom bought me 5 Lincoln biographies. So I have plenty of Lincoln biographies. Love him, great man. But as far as being a conservative, I think I became more self-conscious of it when I was in 8th grade, when we started studying Jefferson, Hamilton, and other, you know, the founding of the Constitution and more American history generally, and just kind of seeing where I aligned. And I was more or less on the conservative side. And then this is probably when, you know, there are always kind of moments that you didn't think at the time were like big moments, but then years go on, you're like, oh, this was actually a big thing, but I didn't understand that at the time. I don't know if that's happened to you or not. So I think this was in 2004. This was Bush versus Kerry. And obviously I was in 8th grade, not allowed to vote, but part of our class, our history class, because contemporary politics is shaped by history too, we had to watch all the presidential debates and the vice presidential debate. And I remember I was the only person in the class, and remember I'm in California, who supported Bush and Cheney. So that was probably a dead giveaway there.
Wow. So that's really interesting. You know, what do you think of the current political environment that we're in right now? I was involved in politics. I did political consulting back in the day, but I just wanted to kind of get your view on our current political climate. It's a broad question, but I think it's pertinent.
Well, it's a very polarizing time. It's hard to be a conservative at times with how conservatives have how they just fell in love with Donald Trump. I'm still not exactly sure why, because it's not that he's just not he's not really beholden to anything but not any set of principles except I'm awesome. That seems to be the one principle. And yeah, so that was troubling. On the, I've always been, it's always seemed odd to me that people on the liberal side of the spectrum, which is kind of within political theories, yeah. So, I mean, if you put both Democrats and Republicans in the UK, they would all be conservatives. So that's the irony. I've often found it weird that Democrats in this country don't run as much on their accomplishments or what they would perceive as accomplishments. And it's interesting, but I think both parties, if we take the parties to represent conservatism and liberalism, which is philosophically problematic, but let's use it for purposes of the program, they're both in a bit of self-identity crisis of what do we want to be. You know, you have people like President Biden who are more moderate centrist types. Then you have the further leaning left people like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And it's kind of, it seems like the Democrats aren't sure where they want to go, which is too bad because there used to be a time, and it wasn't that long ago, it was within our grandparents and some of our parents' lifetimes when there were liberal and conservative factions of both parties. But it's seeming though a lot of people who are kind of in that moderate spectrum, people like Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, even though they really haven't changed, they're being squeezed out due to certain issues because there's just not a place for them in their party, but not necessarily a place for them in the other party either. So it's very fascinating.
It really is. It really is. Well, thank you for giving me some of your political views and everything. One thing I was just thinking about was, about the priesthood ban. What do you think about the priesthood ban for women? Do you think that should be lifted?
Well, no, I don't. Well, first of all, I don't think those are synonymous types of things because we have Black men before, I guess it was the 1850s, being ordained to the priesthood. We don't have any record, excuse me, of women being ordained, so I don't view those as synonymous. If a revelation came that told President Nelson or a future prophet that women should be ordained, I would be fine with that. But that's up to that would be up to them. I don't think you can draw a parallel that way.
Do you think women should have the priesthood?
No.
Okay, fair enough. So I really enjoyed this conversation.
Let me qualify that. It seems as though God has decided not to give it to them at this time, so I'm fine with that, but I have no objection to them having it, if that makes any sense.
Are you aware of D. Michael Quinn's work where he seems to indicate that Joseph did confer the priesthood to the Relief Society?
I'm very familiar with Quinn's work. I'm sad that we lost him recently. Such a good man, and it's just his story is very sad one. Yes, I am familiar with it. It's similar to I wasn't persuaded by it though, but it's interesting. You have to keep that on the table. Ultimately, though, as I believe the president of the church has the right to receive revelation for the church, and he's the only one who can do that. That would have to be revealed to him. So since that hasn't happened yet, and I don't know that it will, we'll have to maintain the status quo as is.
Okay. Let's see here. I have a quick question for you. You're a sports guy, and I'm from just outside Chicago. Who's the better? Who's
from Chicago?
What's that?
My father is from Chicago.
Okay, so who's the better the greatest of all time, LeBron or Michael?
Oh, depends on how you define greatest. Obviously, I think
Jordan. You can only choose one. You can only choose one as the greatest.
I'm going to say LeBron.
Oof.
Man. I know. as I've said earlier, I'm in the minority about a lot of things. I'm sure this is one of those things too.
That's great. That's awesome. Well, Tarik, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation with me. I think that you are just one of those people who's really thinking outside of the box, making a contribution to your tradition. And I think you're going to play a major role in its evolution in the 21st century. Maybe you could tell me, what does 21st century Mormonism going to look like that would be different than what it is now? I mean, obviously we're in the 21st century, but like as we would define it.
Well, we'll see a lot more being a multicultural church. You're seeing that amongst the general authorities now, where you have a Chinese apostle, a Brazilian apostle, and elders Gong and Suarez. I think that academia, philosophy and theology will play more of a role. I think you'll see, we were just talking about women. I think you'll see women having more of a role in the Relief Society and having broader decision-making power, which I think is a good thing. So those are some things.
Okay. I want to get back. I actually just had a question. There's this idea in the 1960s, it was called process theology. And it was the idea that God is kind of with us in our timeline. So he's not in the future, he's in the present. Is that kind of where you would stand, that God really, like, even with the question of free will, that God really doesn't know what decisions we're going to make because he's with us in the here and now? Is that kind of how you see it?
Well, as you recall, I endorse the Everett view of quantum mechanics, so I'm a determinist. Mm-hmm. So process theology is not what I endorse. Blake Ostler mostly endorses process theology, but the idea is called panentheism. Pantheism is the view that God and all of reality are identical, versus panentheism is that God, kind of by analogy, the cosmos is God's body, and that's how he kind of is with us and governs the cosmos. It's a very open idea for Latter-day Saints. There are even before Whitehead wrote his book Process and Reality, you had people like B.H. Roberts and Orson Pratt who were enunciating very, very similar views. So certainly it's a live option for Latter-day Saints, although not for me.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think this is really fascinating to be able to have this conversation with you and kind of explore these areas. I do want to ask you, what about Calvinism? Have you, because you say you're into determinism, what about predestination and Calvin's worldview?
Well, I accept Calvin's view of the atonement as from the penal substitution view. I accept determinism as being true. I accept a form of foreordination, if that makes any sense. Joseph Smith talked about people being assigned to certain responsibilities before they came to this earth. So there's some of that in there. Obviously, I don't buy into all of Calvin because I'm not a Presbyterian or something like that. But I do admire Calvin.
Does God have free will?
Yes. I think that God works of his own volitions, and that there's nothing that's forcing him to do what he does. Even though God, like all of us, is also a determined agent.
Okay. Well, I am so glad you came on. I keep on thinking of these great questions for you because I just find your mind, the way you think, a very, very original. And I really appreciate you coming on. Tarik, do you have any final words for my audience?
No, other than I'm glad that Protestants, or you describe yourself as an evangelical, and Latter-day Saints are having more productive conversations. There's for some people, there's a very just terse relationship for evangelicals and Latter-day Saints, but I'm seeing more of a shift in that in recent years. Although, understandably, the worldviews are very different. So there will always be some difference, but we don't have to be enemies.
Sounds good. Well, I want to thank you so much, Tarik, for coming onto my program. I just want to remind my audience to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the like button to be informed when a new episode has come out. We are now on many podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. And if you want to reach me, you can reach me at mormonbookreviews@gmail.com. You all be well, and we will get all through this pandemic together.